Other than the podcast itself, the best way to stay in touch with our various goings-on is to be on our mailing list. To sign up, go to spotlightonpodcast.com and click on Newsletter. Thanks. Hello and welcome to Spotlight On, the podcast featuring musicians, writers, innovators, and ideas shaping music, arts, entertainment, and culture. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. Today, the spotlight shines on flautist Jamie Baum. When COVID hit, Jamie found inspiration and solace in poetry. What started as daily readings of women poets' work turned into something much bigger, an album blending jazz and spoken word. As a leader of her long-running Septet Plus, Jamie's crafted wide-ranging music for over 20 years. She's played everywhere from major jazz festivals to tiny clubs in 35 countries, bringing her distinctive sound to collaborations with artists like Paul Motian, Brecker, and Kenny Barron. Now, she's channeling the power of poetry through her ensemble, creating music that speaks to this moment while honoring timeless artistic traditions. Jamie's here to share how verses and melodies came together to tell these stories. So now, Jamie Baum. I wonder if maybe we could start a little bit at the beginning of the current Septet Plus project. What sort of sparked the concept for the album? What led you to explore the integration of poetry and specifically these female poets with this project?
Basically, probably you mentioned you're listening to my music. So up until that point, I really hadn't done any work with voice, except for a couple of things here and there. On my CD before the recent one, I had Amir El-Safar sing wordlessly on Song Without Words. But other than that, not so much. I'm sure you've heard this story many times in many different ways, but I was on tour in March of 2020, supposed to be for the month. And of course, in the middle of the tour, COVID hit, everything shut down. I remember the last gig before the tour stopped, which was at Keystone Corner. And it was March, I think, 13th or something. And there was like 2 tables of people. And the next day, the ordinance was everything had to shut. So I came back to New York and I live at Manhattan Plaza. You may know of that having been in New York, but it's artists' housing. Yeah. And it's in Midtown Manhattan. So I live in a small, by New York standards, it's not that small, but anywhere else it's small, 1 bedroom with my husband. We've been here a long time and we've made it work because one of us is always out doing a gig or rehearsing or on tour. So that leaves a lot of time for the other person to practice or do their thing. Also in Manhattan Plaza, there have practice rooms and I had a studio. And so it was not really a problem. But then COVID hit and everything closed, and so the practice rooms closed, my rehearsal studio closed, there was no teaching. I teach at Manhattan School of Music, nothing in person, and all the gigs and festivals and tours just gone. I was home like everybody, and luckily I love to perform and I love to compose, whereas some people only maybe play, I'm home, okay, what am I going to do now? Well, I can write, I got a keyboard and I can write. So I thought, okay, what am I going to do? I had come out with my last Septet recording maybe a year before that. And I was thinking, okay, I can start another project, but I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I was spending entirely too much time at the computer and on the web and looking at things and perusing. And I don't exactly remember how I found it. It could have been posted on Facebook or something, but I stumbled on this website called A Poet a Day, which was put up by Bill Moyers. I don't know if you know who he is, but I've always been a huge...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I've been a really huge fan of his. I just love his interviews with all sorts of people. And I just, always enjoyed it. And so he put that up and it was really wonderful because it had some kind of like pithy saying that said, we're here to give you solace in these frightening times and hope that the right words in the right order will give you comfort or something like that. So every day he would post a poem he would post a video of the poet reading the poem. And then if he had interviewed that person, perhaps about that poem, or just interviewed them, he would put that up as well. And so I honestly, kind of embarrassingly, I'd never really been a poem person. The first time I got it was I was very lucky to go to MacDowell, which is the artist colony. I don't know if you ever heard of it, but it's a really wonderful artist colony in New Hampshire, the oldest really. And they have a lot of different people. And so one of the things they would do is at the end of the day, after everybody had their own space, you could present something. And so one night they had a couple of guys there that were poets who actually like Pulitzer Prize winners, and they read their poetry. And a light bulb went off in my head. It was like, oh, now I get it. Because hearing somebody actually read it with the intent and the phrasing and the sort of musicality of the rhyming, I got it more than just reading on a page. But to be honest, I didn't really delve into it until I found this website. So I started reading, but as I mentioned before, the exciting thing about it was that you had the poem that you could read and you had the poet reading their poem. And then you had an interview with the poet by Bill Moyers about the poem. So it really grabbed me, especially, with a lot of free time on my hand. And as I started reading, looking at them and checking it out and going back to it, I started thinking to myself, well, I'm the kind of person that I don't really want to repeat myself, with my projects. It's like, okay, I did that. Okay, now I want to do something else. It's not like I did that. I want to do that again. Or I might do it for a couple of CDs, but then I'm sort of ready to delve into something else. And so I thought, I never really wrote using words or for vocalists, lyrics. So, maybe this is a good opportunity, especially since I have all this time ahead of me. God knows how long it's going to last, but I can really focus on this.
Yeah.
So as I started to read the poems, I was looking for poems that I thought, there were a few criteria. One, that it spoke to me, obviously, that it had something that I could relate to or that had meaning to me. Two, if I thought it was something I could work with, I could envision a groove, a sound, a concept of that, how I would set that to music. Because the interesting thing about modern poetry is, of course, they don't always rhyme. And the older poetry, there's a lot of rhyme and symmetry to it. So, trying to figure that out. It was a combination of those things. And as I started to pick, I started to notice that the ones I was picking was some women poet. I didn't actually go in there to saying, oh, this is what I want to do, but I started noticing that. And then I just kind of went with it because it was really what I found. And also, I've always been somewhat political. We've been going through some pretty crazy times for quite a while now. A lot of the things that were being communicated in these poems had meaning for me in relationship to that as well. It just felt like an opportunity for me to do something I hadn't done and express some of the feelings I've been having about what's been going on and find a way to set that to music. So that's the backstory to that. And each one of the poems actually does have some different kinds of meanings. So for example, there's a piece that was written by Adrienne Rich, which is called What Kinds of Times Are These? She based her poem on a poem by Bertolt Brecht, who wrote his poem right around the time of the Nazi invasion. And what he was basically saying was, it's too dangerous to even talk about trees. Like, you have to be really careful about what you say. And of course, there has been a lot of book banning, and there's been, a lot of discussion about what's happening with the kinds of news that we're getting and all that kind of stuff. And so it just, unfortunately, a lot of these themes, when you're working with them, and certainly the ones I was working with was in 2020 and 21, which was sort of before a lot of things have been happening. And so you never know as an artist if what you're going to do is going to still be relevant by the time you actually get it out. And you hope it is, but on the other hand, you hope it isn't.
In some cases, you don't want it to be.
In some cases, you want it to be. But unfortunately, now I'm even wondering whether this recording's going to get banned, unfortunately. So that was one that really struck me. And then also My Grandmother and the Stars, which was by Naomi Shihab Nye. And that's interesting because on a number of levels, like for one thing, I was going through a period where I was sharing in the caretaking of my mother who lived in Connecticut, who had dementia Alzheimer's. And then she finally passed last February. I couldn't see her for like a year because she was elderly, and until I was able to get the vaccine and she could. And then I was going out there almost every week or every other week sharing in her caretaking. It was really helpful for me to have a place to sort of put my emotions and feelings about it. And I actually ended up talking with Naomi or emailing back and forth. And the interesting thing was that she wrote it about her grandmother in Palestine, because that's where her family is from. That's her heritage, even though she lives in San Antonio. And so she wrote it about her grandmother, and I wrote it for my mother, who was at a point where she couldn't really understand it or listen to it or have interest, It is very similar because it starts out, is possible we will not meet again on earth, to think this fills my throat with dust, and then there is only the sky tying the universe together. And so it was really interesting because she was talking about her grandmother in Palestine, and she's Palestinian and I'm Jewish. And of course, this was before the Gaza war. But so now that even is more interesting, that in a more sort of symbolic way, we wrote this piece together.
That's very humanizing, right? It makes you realize that regardless of where you're from, we have these shared experiences with our family and our parents and through the generations. Like none of us are immune to those sufferings. We all have them in our unique ways, but very few of us manage to skirt dealing with that stuff.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So, that each sort of piece held a different kind of meaning for me as I would work with the poem, it would sort of become clear to me what I wanted to do with it musically. So like Lucille Clifton's piece, Sorrow Song, when I saw that, the way the phrases were really reminded me kind of a rap piece. And so I'd always really wanted to work with Kokai, and I was lucky that he was interested. And so that's kind of how it came about. Tell me a little bit. First of all, before I ask you my follow-up, I just want to say, any opportunity to be reminded about Bill Moyers it always makes my day a little. It's like, it reminds me of this time where we actually had public intellectuals and we didn't hate them. Right. I know. I have to tell you, being a kid who grew up and really listened to him on PBS and just missed that as well. I hadn't really even thought about connecting with him. And then this summer, somebody said, "What do you think of your recording?" And I'm like, "I don't know. I didn't send it to him." "You didn't send it to him. You should send it to him." So I was like, yeah, maybe I should. I have no idea how to get in touch with him, but I went to the website. Of course, his information wasn't on there, but there was information you could email. So I emailed and I said, "I'm a musician and I just did this recording, based on this website. And I thought it would be nice if I could send him the CD." 2 hours later, I got an email back. Nothing. It didn't say, "Dear so-and-so, thank you, blah, blah, blah." It just said, "Please send to Bill Moyers."
Yeah.
Some address, Central Park South or something. I'm like, "Oh, okay." And I figured it was like an office, and his office person would get it. So, I quickly ran to the post office and I wrote him a letter just saying that I was a fan. And 3 days later, he emailed me and he just loved it. He said, "My only regret is that I'm no longer doing interviews. Otherwise, I'd schedule you for one." I was like, But he did give me a quote, which he said I could use, and on the CD. So that was very cool. One of the highlights. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. I love hearing that. That's really beautiful. That's really beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, because he's 90 or something, retired, and like,
Yeah.
But it was meaningful that I forget, I have it on my thing, but it said something like a masterpiece of sound and spirit or something like that. Like, oh, okay, I'll take that.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I'm going to badly paraphrase you. When you were speaking a moment ago, you talked about how each poem sort of elicited the musical direction you were going to go in, or gave you direction about where to go. And I'm really curious, at the risk of like boiling this down to process, could you peel back a layer on that a little bit? And if you are able to, could you articulate a little bit about how did something go from you consuming a piece of poetry, connecting with it, and it translating into music? Do you have a meditative process? Do you just channel? And do you think? Do you not think? I'm really curious because there's a bit of alchemy going on there, right?
Oh, totally alchemy. And sometimes I feel like it's channeling because I was like, did I write that? For someone who got my undergrad master's in jazz composition, I'm a very intuitive writer. I know so many people that map things out and they're going to work with these chord changes and then blah, blah, blah. I don't often do that. I just usually sit at the piano and noodle till I come up with something. I've been asked this question kind of a lot, and particularly for this group, which has been, I like to say, my compositional muse for a long time, because this is the 5th recording I've done with that instrumentation. And I tend to work the last few years well with a concept, much better than just whatever, which is why I like CDs, because I see an arc or I see a concept or a direction or a thread. Every time is different. And so that's what I try to communicate to my students as well, is that I don't think there's one way of doing things, and I don't have one way of doing things. I use a program called Digital Performer, which is a sequencing program. And that's been hugely helpful for me because while I play enough piano to get around with ideas, I don't play well enough to play things in time, and certainly not with so many voices and things going on. So having the ability to come up with some ideas and then put them in there and then hear it back in real time is hugely helpful, because I like to try to have things progress organically. And invariably, the first ideas are inspirational. They come from somewhere. And then, of course, there's always like it stops. And then, okay, now what? And so that's where I think skill and patience in terms of getting out of your own way of wanting something to be something, but trying to see what it wants to be.
Mm-hmm.
When I was younger and not as experienced composer, I might have an idea, well, I want this to be an up-tempo burning tune. And then I'm noodling around, I come up with a melody, I'm forcing it into a tempo that it doesn't want to be. So sometimes you have to put down what your initial idea is and stand back and allow yourself to see what it is and what it wants to be. And so sometimes, I'll play something back 50 times until I hear what needs to happen next. Or I'll sing it in the shower when I'm walking until I hear what needs to happen next. Or I'll play something and I'll bring it to a rehearsal or a session and then see that this needs that, this needs that. I mean, some pieces come fast, other pieces, like an old story, I think by the time I recorded it, I was on the 15th version. So you have to be flexible enough to hear and see what something needs. Sometimes, like with this particular project, to be honest, I'm not sure if I will be successful again, because I feel very good about this project because I actually the silver lining to COVID was that I actually had uninterrupted time where I was able to actually organically develop these ideas and come back to them on a daily basis and work with them, which is really unusual. And I think for most musicians that are not just solely composers, because, you got to go teach or you got a gig or you go on tour and then you come back to it and you're kind of in a different place. So that was a really wonderful thing. And then another thing that I did was sometimes I set up little challenges for myself because I was home, and I find that you really screw yourself. People talk about writer's block, and I don't really believe in writer's block. Writer's block is kind of like a name for all these pressures you put on yourself. So like if you say, oh, I got to write the best thing I ever wrote, then of course you're going to have a writer's block. Mm-hmm. Or if you are trying to do better than you did, or you're trying to do this, or you're trying to do that, then you're going to not like it and you're going to get stuck. So I try to just look at it as an exercise, so that I'm working on it, and then go back and erase it or change it or fix it. So in some cases, there were certain things that I wanted to set up for myself. Whenever I do that, the music always kind of has to win out in terms of what needs to happen. But so, for example, with that tune, What Times Are These? One of the challenges I wanted to give myself was, I grew up not only loving jazz, but I loved singer-songwriter stuff like James Taylor or Carole King or Stevie Wonder or, of course, the Beatles and these different things. And it was like, okay, wonder if I could write something that is singer-songwriter-ish, like with an intro and a refrain and a chorus and it coming back, and certain things that are very typical of what I learned when I was going to school and I had to take film score. Like certain very predictable things elicit different kinds of emotional responses. So like if you're watching a movie and you hear diminished chord, it's like, oh, I'm afraid now, Or maybe something now I'm thinking about, I'm sorry, with My Grandma and the Stars, I was thinking that. So it starts out, it is possible. So it goes up with the word possible because it's hopeful. We will not meet again on earth. So that's kind of sad, and it goes down. Wow. So I was just setting up little challenges for myself, to see if I could think that way and where that would bring me and how that would change my compositional skills or technique. So anyway.
Yeah, that example reminds me a little bit of some of the conventions, even like in the American Songbook or from musical theater, this idea that the lyric and the melody will rise and fall based on the emotion that the character is trying to convey.
I should have included Cole Porter and all that stuff because, I was a huge fan of all that, of course, and spent many years learning standards. So that is in there for sure.
We'll be back with more Spotlight On and Jamie Baum right after this break.
After listening to this episode, head to thetonearm.com, our new online journal covering unexpected music and culture. This week on The Tone Arm, electronic music producer Greg Davis takes us into the heart of New Age music. Pianist Marina Albero finds inspiration in the music of New Orleans. Bruder Selke and Midori Hirano boldly experiment with musical scales. And Passepartout Duo discover the music between human expression and machine logic. You'll find all this and more on The Tone Arm. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe to our email newsletter. That's thetonearm.com. The Tone Arm, putting a needle on the cultural wax.
And now, back to Spotlight On. That point segs really well into what I wanted to ask you next, which is sort of concerns like the musical terrain you cover, whether it's incorporating or exploring qawwali or maqam or now poetry and spoken word. And I'm really curious, how do these explorations, how do they impact your composing style? I would imagine there's an accumulation that happens over time, like influences come in and they get metabolized. But I'm really curious, like, can you feel it happening?
So many things like that are in retrospect. You know what I mean? When I'm working on things, I'm not necessarily thinking about that. But of course, when I look at things that I do, I can see that. But, it's really a combination of everything. I spent a lot of time in my younger years playing and listening to classical music, as well as jazz and Brazilian music. I mean, both my downfall and my positive side are that I have very eclectic tastes. Some people are I just do this, and then they become really successful because they're so focused on that one thing. And I just always, I love playing classical music. I love playing jazz. I love playing Brazilian music. I really have a lot of different interests of music and culture. And so I started out learning and playing classical and jazz and different kinds of music. And also when I was studying composition, my first couple of CDs with the band were focused on Stravinsky, Ives, Bartok, and all that. So one of the really important influences for me very early on was I just loved Stravinsky's Rite of Spring and Stravinsky and Bach and a lot of that. So when I first started writing and playing the flute, I was playing the flute, I was doing a lot of classical gigs that were, to make money when I moved to New York, and I was playing with really great string players from like Juilliard, doing private functions or weddings or whatever. And we were playing a lot of chamber music, Bach chamber music, where the counterpoint where, I was a line. There were all these lines going on. And especially like with Bach, you might be playing for like 5 minutes and you don't feel like you're together. And then all of a sudden you cadence or you come together and then diverge. And I really enjoyed that. And at the time, this was like in the 90s, not only the flute was kind of a miscellaneous instrument. I mean, it's changed a lot now, but then it was. But also you had the typical format where you have like the horn players in the front, or when I was playing quartet, I was playing the melody and the rhythm section was doing stuff. And it always seemed like they were playing more together and having more fun. Than I was, and I wanted to sort of be a middle line sometimes. I sort of was studying Bach and Stravinsky, Rite of Spring, where you got all these different lines and these ostinatos and different things going on, or Ives, different things going on. So I really wanted to try to make the flute more legitimate. It's not just a double on a bossa nova or ballad. And then also find ways to not always be the top line or the melody, but the counterpoint and all the stuff going on. I started writing, trying to come up with some different formats with this. It seemed like a good, for my master's, I started, in 99, I started the Septet. And that was, instead of having your typical trumpet, alto sax, tenor, trombone, or bari, I wanted the flute to have more weight. And if I had those, it would seem small. So if I had alto, knew a guy who played alto and bass clarinet, that would give me more colors, and trumpet. And then I had a friend who played French horn, my friend who lives in Seattle. It seemed to offer more weight to the flute, but also a lot more colors that I could use to create like these different formats. That was what I was going for. And then after I spent some time doing that, during that time, I was doing some traveling. I was a jazz ambassador for the State Department. I did a couple of really long tours, 5-week tours, and then they sent me out again. So I went to South Asia, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Nepal. And I'd always loved Indian music. And even as far back as my first Septet CD, I was using the piece from Trilok Urtu that I sort of connected with the Stravinsky piece. So, when you tour, you get to play with people and they were from there and they turn you on to stuff. And I got really interested in Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. His music really touched me. I felt like it was like kind of like Pavarotti or Coltrane. There's something very amazing about it. And also having traveled a lot and been in those countries, it's a no-brainer for a composer. This Indian music and South Asian music has no harmony. So this is wide open for like a kid in candy store, And also, there was a lot to be learned from the way they constructed the scales and how they embellished it in terms of relating that to improvisation. Also, there was a lot of call and response that is somewhat similar in a way to jazz, and trading. And because I feel like at the core, when I came up, what attracted me to jazz was Miles Davis and Coltrane and people like that. And I'm not putting myself at all on that level, but what attracted me about them was that they were always moving forward. They never wanted to do the same thing again. Once they did that, they were looking for other ways to expand their skills or their knowledge or what they were doing. And so that was what attracted me. What I've tried to do is just, okay, what can I do now that I haven't done? But that doesn't mean that what I did before I was an expert. It's just, I just work with things that turn me on. And I hope that if it turns me on, it'll turn other people on, that excite me, that interest. Oh, I really want to know how he did that. So then I'll, like with the Nusrat on In This Life, it opens with this vocal improvisation that I transcribed of Nusrat, that I put on all the horns, and it was very informative about rhythmic displacement. And you'd never really get that unless you slowed it down 5 times, And so I feel like, even though I may not be cognizant of it, when I look at some of the things that I've written, of course, they incorporate those influences and those skills that I learned about counterpoint, or those skills I learned about voice leading, or the skills that I learned about balance or tension, or how to orchestrate for those instruments.
There's something in your story that strikes me, and for lack of a better way to say it, it's, you even alluded to the fact that when you were coming up, the flute was sort of, if it was thought of at all, it was thought of differently in the context of especially jazz and creative music. It strikes me then that you had a commitment to that instrument. Who were you looking to? Did you have flautists that were inspirational to you, or did you have a sense of you were charting the unknown? Like, could you talk about your relationship with the instrument and if there was lineage you could draw on?
Yeah, it's kind of weird. Like, I look at really amazing flute players like Nicole Mitchell, and, who were obviously just completely enamored with the instrument. I don't know if I had that same passion. It was kind of more a vehicle for me. I started playing piano when I was a kid, when I was like 3, because my mom had played piano and trombone. And so I studied piano, and I actually wasn't serious. I never thought I'd be a musician. I had some other interests and things. But I did like jazz. And there was a guy who lived in town near me who taught jazz piano. And I took lessons with him, I think for about a year, when I was like maybe 12 or 13. But I won't mention his name, but he was really bad alcoholic. And I always had my lesson at like 9 a.m. on Monday morning when he wasn't in a very good mood. That didn't go very well. So I quit piano. And then I took up flute when I was like in junior high or high school or something, very unseriously.
Was it that classic situation of like the kid, like to be in band, they put the instruments out and like some kids gravitate towards the cello and like it's go find the one that's calling you kind of thing?
I wish I could say it was even that. It was more like my parents had this beach house for the summer, and there were these 2 cute guys that were next door, and they would always sit out and play guitar. So I got my parents to get me a flute so I could go meet them. And the rest is history. I think the thing that kept me sticking with the flute was that it was a very versatile instrument. It allowed me to play a lot of different kinds of music, because I was toying a little bit with saxophone. And of course, in those days, my parents were not, they let me do anything I wanted, but they were not particularly pushing me toward the saxophone because it wasn't really a girl's instrument. The thing about the flute was that I could play classical music to saxophone. It's like an oxymoron. Like flute in classical, I could play classical music. I could play jazz. I could play Brazilian, Latin. It was very versatile. And I think always the music was more what interests me than the actual instrument. I enjoyed it. It was challenging to get a good sound. And I liked that it was mobile after playing piano. And it stuck. I don't know. Terrible. I should have some like epiphany, but
yeah. You've worked with ensembles of varying sizes, and now to have something like Septet Plus, to have this longevity to it, I don't want to say it's rare, but it's certainly interesting and provides a certain perspective. What keeps drawing you back to that format? And how stable has the lineup been, or how shifting has it been? So I'm curious about, your affinity for the format as well as your long-term relationship, not only with the format, but with the players.
Mm-hmm. Before that, I had been doing quartet, quintet.
Mm-hmm.
The 2 recordings I did before the septet were that vein. The one I did before that was actually had Dave Douglas and Kenny Werner, and Dave was playing in my band at the time. And though I had gone back to school, I was getting my master's in composition. And so my teacher was like, for your recital, you really need to do something bigger. And that's when as I was mentioning, why I chose that instrumentation. I started writing for that instrumentation, and I think I found my voice in a way through that. I mean, like I said, I love things about Stravinsky and Bach where there's a lot of things going on at once.
Yep.
Being that as a flute player, and I never played in big band, while in some ways I could see that as an extension of my love of having a lot of things going on and voicings, and I never played in it, and I've been like very selfish about my writing. It's like I want to play in it. So being that I didn't play in a big band, I didn't really feel like writing for a big band if I couldn't play in it, or just to write, So the personnel has changed, but not for long periods. So for the first 10 years, when I was really focused on sort of the classical influences, it was fairly stable. It's really interesting because the people that I had in my band were not well known when they were in my band, but as it got toward later, then they started to become really well known. So they started to become busy. Occasionally they would, so sometimes I did have subs, but it was pretty set for the first 2 CDs. And that was great because it's really wonderful. First of all, they're amazing musicians. And second of all, it's really wonderful to know who you're writing for. And also, they're very fearless players. So a lot of times I would write things because I wanted to learn how to play them. Because, of course, in those days, odd meters and things, you didn't find them in the real book. So if you wanted to try to learn how to play things, you had to write it yourself. A lot of times they'd bring things in, and first they'd give me a dirty look. You want me to play that? But then they were amazing, and they would. And they would bring to it more than I could have even wished for, And so they were really incredible to get to play with and to interpret what I was trying to do. And I had a sense I could really try things and they would eat it up. They would be up for it. So that was very exciting. And then, as I mentioned, I was starting to tour. I was doing those tours in South Asia. I was feeling like I really wanted to go in that direction with the music. And it coincided at the time with some change in personnel. So like George Culligan, who'd been in my band, we had kids and he wanted to move and get teaching. And so he left. So I needed a new piano player. And then Ralph was getting very busy and well known. And so I had met and played some with Amir El-Safar, and we talked about wanting to do some stuff together. So it just seemed like the right time to go in that direction because, of course, Amir brought a lot of those influences into the music, and John Escreed had balance. And then I brought in Brad Shepik, who was very great guitar player, but also really interested in a lot of other types of music and had experiences in that. And of course, Asian music, South Asian music, you have a lot of stringed instruments, sitar and this and that. And so I really wanted to bring that influence in as well. So that was an inspiration for that change. And so it kind of worked well in that way.
Yeah, organic.
So that lasted for almost another 10 years and then of course Amir started getting really busy with this million projects as he should. And John Escreed, moved to LA, and the instrumentation didn't really change that much, but some of the personnel did. It was kind of a little bit seamless because sometimes they overlap. And then for this project, things again, like Amir started to get busy. And so I started to work with Jonathan and then also, I added vocalists, and I also wanted to add some percussion.
I wanted to ask you, The stylistic choice, or maybe the narrative choice, to open and close the record with two instrumentals, despite the fact that this is the record with really truly introducing vocals and lyrics. What are you saying there? What are you putting across?
I wrote the first piece before the other pieces, and it was really, in some ways, part of the Shiva suite, the suite for Nepal in my last recording. I wrote this suite as a tribute to Nepal after the earthquake, because I just came back from there my fourth time, and I just really loved the place, and it was just so painful to see what happened. And I put together a fundraiser, and we did it at Le Poisson Rouge. Anyway, that was in 2015. So I sort of was thinking like a prequel almost, what was it like before that? When you go there, it's just crazy, like cacophony. I mean, like they don't have any. In Kathmandu, they have no stoplights or stop signs, and it's 5 million motorcycles and cars from 50s. And people are just, they have one-way streets, but nobody pays attention, and there's no sidewalks. And it's just crazy, but really wonderful at the same time, but just this intensity. And same within India, like so many people, there's no sense of personal space. It's just like a whole different thing. It's just this kind of mass. I had this piece that I had written, but it has singing bowls, and it just really was trying to give a sense of this manic pace. And in context of COVID and how that just everything shut that down, and the things that I was trying to convey with the pieces and the order of the pieces, it just seemed like it really fit, and even in those years where we're thinking of I instead of we. It's just like this intensely where we're going along, and just craziness of New York City. It's like everybody's into themselves and their own aggressive me, getting further and further. And then all of a sudden, boom, like COVID was like a plague. It just like stopped us in our tracks. And those people who made use of it to contemplate did, and those people who didn't. But it sort of felt like it was a precursor. It was like this intensity, and now we're stuck in our tracks, and now we have to understand what happened through these poems. And so you go through the poems, and they're ordered at first what happened, and then these different reflections of different sides of it. As you get toward the end of the recording, you have dreams, which is a little more hopeful, and then you have some of these other things. And then what I wanted to do was I took elements from the first piece, In the Light of Day, and I used them for In the Day of Light. What I wanted to do was have instead of it all being crazy and cacophonous, I wanted to have each line sometimes be separate, sometimes come together and be harmonious, sort of signifying that, we can all live side by side, not having to be the same. Hopefully it gives that kind of feeling through the writing.
Thank you so much, Jamie Baum. And as always, thank you for listening to Spotlight On. Spotlight On is executive produced and hosted by me, Lawrence Purrier. We're produced and marketed by Michael Donaldson. Editing and sound design is by Terry Graham. Our theme music, that's by Q-Burn's Abstract Message. The most important member of our team is you. Thank you for supporting our work. Please rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts, and then visit us online at spotlightonpodcast.com. There you'll find our free episode archive, our online store, and a link to make a donation to support our work. Thanks for listening, be safe, and stay in touch.